Before the world had a name, there was a river. It ran between the land of the living and the land of the dead, not through any landscape but through the fabric of existence itself. The river was wide and dark and cold, and its currents carried not water but memory. Every thought ever forgotten, every dream ever lost upon waking, every moment that had slipped through the cracks of time flowed in its depths. No living thing could cross it without help. No dead thing could cross it alone. And so the gods, in their wisdom or their cruelty, appointed a ferryman. His name was Kael, though the later myths would call him by other names in other languages. He was not alive and not dead, not a god and not a mortal, but something in between, shaped specifically for the task of carrying souls from one shore to the other. He had been given a boat, a pole, and a single instruction: take them across. Every soul. No exceptions, no refusals, no rest. The first soul to reach the riverbank was a child. She had died of fever before her first summer, and she stood at the water's edge looking confused and frightened, too young to understand what had happened to her. Kael guided her onto the boat, settled her on the bench at the bow, and pushed off from the shore. The crossing took as long as it needed to take. For the child it was brief, a gentle rocking, a play of lights on water and then the other shore, where the gray mist parted to reveal something that made the child smile. Kael never saw what the dead saw when they reached the other side. That was not for him. He only saw them step off the boat and walk forward, drawn by something he could not perceive. Then he turned the boat around and poled back to the living shore, where more souls were already waiting. Time meant nothing on the river. Kael ferried souls through centuries that he did not count. Warriors and farmers, kings and beggars, mothers clutching infants, old men walking alone. Some came peacefully, accepting what had happened. Others came screaming, raging, begging for more time. A few came laughing, relieved to be free of pain or fear or the simple exhaustion of being alive. Kael took them all. He learned to read the dead the way a sailor reads the sea, understanding their moods, their needs, the small comforts that would ease their passage. For the frightened, he rode slowly and steadily. For the angry, he let them stand and shout into the void until the echo came back and they heard how small their fury sounded against the infinite. For the sad, he said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and his silence was its own form of respect. Kael was tall and lean, with features that shifted subtly depending on who was looking at him. The young saw a young man. The old saw an old one. Children saw a face that reminded them of safety, though they could never quite say whose face it was. He wore a simple gray cloak over simple gray clothes, and his hands, which gripped the ferry pole for eternity, were the only part of him that never changed. They were strong and scarred and calloused, the hands of a worker, and they were the first thing the dead saw when he reached out to help them into the boat. He did not eat, he did not sleep, he did not age, but he felt. That was the cruelty of his design. The gods had made him capable of empathy, of sorrow, of the full range of emotions that mortals experienced, because a ferryman without feeling would be merely a mechanism, and the dead deserved more than a mechanism. They deserved a witness. The tradition of the coin began with the Greeks, though Kael had been ferrying souls long before Greece existed. A philosopher, newly dead, had insisted on paying for his passage. Nothing of value should be given freely, he argued. To accept a service without payment degrades both the giver and the receiver. Kael had tried to refuse. He had no use for money. But the philosopher was persistent, and Kael, who had learned patience over millennia, eventually accepted a small bronze coin simply to end the argument. The philosopher had placed it under his tongue before dying, a final act of preparation for the journey he knew was coming. Word spread, as ideas do, across the living world. Soon, every Greek was buried with a coin in their mouth or on their eyes. The tradition traveled to Rome, to Egypt, to cultures that had never met a Greek but had somehow absorbed the idea that the ferryman must be paid. Kael accumulated coins. He had no pockets, so he dropped them in the river, where they sank into the current of memories and were lost. In all the millennia of ferrying, only one person had ever asked to go back. She was a musician, a young woman who had died in an earthquake and who stood at the riverbank holding a broken lyre, looking at the far shore with an expression not of fear but of calculation. "I left something unfinished," she said. "A song. It was going to be the best thing I ever composed. I was 3 measures from the end when the ceiling came down." Kael explained, as he always did, that the crossing was one way. The dead did not return. She nodded, as if she had expected this answer, and then she sat down on the riverbank and began to play the broken lyre. The instrument had only 2 intact strings, but what she coaxed from those strings was the most beautiful sound Kael had heard in 6,000 years of listening. The song was haunting and incomplete, trailing off where the final measures should have been, an absence that was more powerful than any resolution. The river itself seemed to slow, its currents quieting to listen. When she finished, she boarded the boat without another word. But the song stayed. It echoed off the water and the mist, and Kael heard it for centuries afterward, a melody without an ending, the most human thing he had ever encountered. The worst times were the wars. Souls arrived not in ones and twos, but in thousands, tens of thousands, waves of the dead so vast that Kael's small boat could not possibly carry them all. During these times the river responded to the need. It narrowed, allowing Kael to make faster crossings. Additional boats appeared on the shore, though Kael never saw who placed them there. He ferried continuously, without pause, for days, weeks, months. The war dead were different from the peacefully dead. They were confused, disoriented, often still in the grip of whatever violence had killed them. Soldiers reached for weapons that no longer existed. Civilians called out for family members who were not there, or who were there and could not be found in the crowd. Children, always the children, stood silent and bewildered among the press of adult souls. And Kael, who had been doing this for longer than any war had lasted, still had to clench his jaw against the grief each time he lifted a small, still figure into the boat. After a war that killed more people than any before it, a war whose weapons turned cities to ash and left shadows burned into stone, Kael did something he had never done. He stopped. He planted his pole in the riverbed and held the boat still in the current and simply stopped. The souls lined up on the shore. The river flowed. The far bank waited. And Kael, the eternal ferryman, the one who was made to serve and to feel and never to rest, asked a question that echoed across the space between worlds. He asked the gods why, not why the dead had to cross, not why he had been chosen, but why the dead kept coming in waves, in floods, in numbers that no single ferryman could process. Why the living, who had music and sunlight and the warmth of each other's hands, kept finding new and more efficient ways to fill his boat. The gods did not answer. They never did. But the river shifted its current just slightly, as if acknowledging that the question had been heard. After a silence that lasted what might have been a year or a century, Kael began ferrying again. But something had changed. The question he had asked, the first act of defiance in his eternal service, had altered something in the fabric of his existence. He could still feel empathy. He could still grieve for the dead he carried. But now he also felt something new. Purpose. Not the purpose the gods had assigned him, the mechanical purpose of carrying souls from one shore to the other. A deeper purpose, one that he chose for himself. He began to speak to the dead during the crossing. Not instructions, not the rote comfort that the task required, but real words. Stories. He told each soul in the brief time they shared the boat one true thing about the world they were leaving. A sunset he had watched from the river, a song the musician had played, a child's laughter he had heard echoing across the water. He gave them, as his own gift, one last beautiful memory of the living world to carry with them into whatever waited on the far shore. And so it continues. The river flows, the souls arrive. The ferryman carries them across, one by one, group by group, generation after generation. He has been doing this since before history began, and he will be doing it long after history ends. He has seen civilizations rise and fall reflected in the faces of their dead. He has carried the first humans who walked upright, and he will carry the last ones who draw breath. He does not know if there will ever be a final soul, a last passenger, a moment when the boat comes to rest and the river grows still. He suspects not. Life is stubborn, it persists. And as long as there is life, there will be death, and as long as there is death, there will be a river to cross and a ferryman to make the crossing. But sometimes, in the rare quiet moments between arrivals, Kael rests his pole against the side of the boat and listens to the river. In its currents, he can hear everything. Every memory ever lost, every dream ever forgotten. The musician's unfinished song still echoing after all these centuries. And beneath it all, steady and constant, the sound of the living world continuing. Breathing, growing, loving, dying, coming to the river, stepping into the boat, taking the hand of the ferryman who is the last kind face they will ever see and crossing over to whatever comes next. It is not a happy story, but it is a true one. And Kael, who has heard every story ever ended, knows that the true ones are the only ones worth telling.